Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was born on April 22, 1870, in the small town of Simbirsk, located in the central part of the Russian Empire. Very few people realized that this modest and unassuming town was witnessing the birth of a man who would one day change the course of world history. The Ulyanov family belonged to the upper middle class, deeply involved in education and bureaucracy. His father, Ilya Nikolaevich, worked as a school inspector, while his mother was a loving and cultured woman devoted to her family and children. Vladimir's childhood was relatively peaceful and disciplined. Even at a young age, his extraordinary intelligence and eagerness to learn caught the attention of those around him. However, young Vladimir's life would soon be shaken to its core. The year 1887 marked a turning point for both the family and young Vladimir. His older brother, Alexander, was arrested for plotting an assassination against Tsar Alexander III. The aim of this conspiracy was to bring an end to the oppressive and authoritarian regime in Russia. But the attempt failed, and Alexander was executed. This event left a deep scar in Vladimir's life. At just 17 years old, he deeply felt the vital importance of justice, equality, and freedom. The execution of his brother pushed him toward revolution, radical ideas, and eventually set him on a path that would alter the course of history. Vladimir began his education in Simbirsk and later enrolled in Kazan University to study law. His years in law school were spent trying to understand the structure of the state, the legal system, social order, and justice. But Vladimir was more interested in the ideas of his time and the social injustices than in traditional legal education. He became familiar with the works of Marx and other socialist thinkers. The class divisions at the root of society, the system of exploitation, and the misery of workers and peasants left a deep impression on his mind. At the time, Russia was in great turmoil. The Tsarist regime protected the interests of vast landowners and aristocrats, while millions lived in poverty. It was in this environment that Lenin's revolutionary spirit began to grow. Lenin also became involved with intellectual circles. In the 1890s, he established connections with revolutionary groups in St. Petersburg and Moscow. He believed that the future of Russia could only be realized through the will of the people, by freeing themselves from exploitation and oppression. In 1895, he was arrested for his revolutionary activities and exiled to Siberia. This 3-year exile became both a trial and a learning period in Lenin's life. The writings, analyses, and thoughts he produced in exile made him not just an opponent, but also an ideologue. When he returned from exile, he was no longer the same Vladimir. He was now a revolutionary, and before him lay only one path: to force a radical transformation of Russia. Before and after his exile, Lenin developed a deep connection with the works of Marx. The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, written in the mid-19th century by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, formed the foundation of Lenin's worldview. Marx's theory of historical materialism explained that societies develop based on their economic foundations, and that the conflict between classes is the driving force of historical progress. For Lenin, this was not merely a theory, it was a reality embodied in the hunger, poverty, and oppression he witnessed in Russia. Lenin made great efforts to adapt Marx's theory to the conditions of Russia. In his view, the dictatorship of the proletariat should represent not only the workers but also the peasants. This ideology quickly propelled Lenin to prominence within the revolutionary movement. After his arrest in 1895, he was exiled to Siberia. However, he did not see this period solely as punishment, he also viewed it as a time for learning and reflection. During his exile, he engaged with the local population, observed the lives of peasants, and deeply understood their problems. He also corresponded with revolutionary socialists in Europe, exchanging ideas and strategies. In the early 1900s, Lenin lived in various European cities: Switzerland, Germany, France, and England. Though far from Russia, he continued to spread his revolutionary ideas and organize. In 1902, with the publication of What Is to Be Done, he defined the structure of the revolutionary movement. In his view, a tightly disciplined, centralized party with a strict ideological line was a prerequisite for a successful revolution. These ideas played a crucial role in the 1903 split of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Under Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks advocated for a more radical, revolutionary, and centralized structure, while the Mensheviks adopted a more moderate and reformist approach. Lenin quickly rose as the leader of the Bolsheviks and built a loyal cadre around him. During the 1905 Russian Revolution, he briefly returned to Russia, but the uprising ended in failure. He emphasized that the revolutionary process was still premature and that patience was necessary. Lenin's struggles during this period reinforced both his political acumen and ideological resolve. This phase of ideological formation and mobilization laid the groundwork for the Great Revolution that would erupt in 1917. For Lenin, revolution was not merely a goal, it was a necessity. In the early 1900s, the cities of Europe beyond Russia's borders became a new battleground for Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. From Zurich in Switzerland to Munich in Germany, from Paris in France to London in England, he lived, worked, and wrote in many cities. These years marked a critical period during which he refined his ideas and shaped the course of the Russian Revolution. His 1902 publication What is to be Done contained proposals that would determine the future of the revolutionary movement. In this book, Lenin outlined in detail how a revolutionary party should function. According to him, revolutionaries should consist not only of workers but of the most advanced and conscious individuals, act with strict discipline, and be organized in a centralized structure. In 1903, a significant split occurred within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, and the more moderate Mensheviks went their separate ways. The Bolsheviks believed that the revolution must be carried out through radical, swift, and decisive actions, while the Mensheviks sought a more evolutionary and conciliatory path. This process marked a new turning point in Lenin's political career. Although in exile across Europe, he tried to lead the movement in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The first major worker and peasant uprising in Russia in 1905 was both a source of hope and a lesson for him. The revolution failed, but it left a deep impression on the consciousness of the people. Lenin learned much from this failed attempt. He came to understand that revolution would not happen suddenly, but through a long-term and carefully planned strategy. The articles, letters, and political analyses he published during these years strengthened the ideological line of the Bolsheviks. While in exile in Europe, he established strong ties with opposition figures in Russia. He published revolutionary newspapers and drafted party programs. All of this work served as a kind of preparation for the revolution of 1917. Lenin's years in exile were among the most difficult, yet most productive, periods of his life, both personally and politically. At the beginning of the 20th century, life for Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had extended far beyond the borders of Russia. It had become a global struggle. After emerging from exile in Siberia, he settled in Europe in the early 1900s. This journey, which began in Zurich, Switzerland, continued through key centers such as Germany, France, and England. Lenin's years in exile in Europe were not merely a change in physical location, they marked a period of intellectual and political maturation. In the progressive intellectual hubs of Europe, he deeply engaged with the writings of socialist theorists like Marx, Engels, and Kautsky. His political exchanges, especially with Karl Kautsky, played an important role in clarifying his own ideas. In 1902, he published What is to be Done. Russian, Sito Delat, which is considered Lenin's political manifesto. This work was not just a theoretical text, but also a guide that thoroughly outlined the model of a revolutionary party. In it, Lenin argued that the fragmented and disorganized workers' movement in Russia needed to be unified. According to him, the fundamental characteristics of a revolutionary party should be strict discipline, centralization, and ideological unity. This approach gained him both supporters and critics. Some socialists believed that such a rigid and centralized structure could lead to authoritarianism. But Lenin defended his view, arguing that the goal was to raise the political consciousness and organizational strength of the working class. In 1903, ideological disagreements within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party led to the formation of two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. This split was not only organizational, but also deeply ideological. Lenin and the Bolsheviks believed the revolution should be led by a centralized, disciplined party, while the Mensheviks favored a broader-based, more pluralistic, and gradual evolutionary approach. This division solidified Lenin's leadership and made him the undisputed leader of the Bolshevik movement. During this time, Lenin didn't just write about his ideas, he also trained young revolutionaries and prepared them for political action. He established the party's underground organizational structure and formed a disciplined cadre. In 1905, the major uprising in Russia involving workers, peasants, and soldiers became a significant test for Lenin. Although this first attempt at revolution failed to overthrow the Tsarist regime, it left deep wounds within society. Following this failure, Lenin briefly returned to Russia and personally led revolutionary activities on the ground. However, due to increasing repression, he was forced to return to Europe once again. During this period, he made great efforts to maintain communication and coordination within the revolutionary movement in Russia. The newspapers he published, the pamphlets he distributed, and the letters he wrote helped ignite the struggle within Russia. Lenin's years in exile in Europe were not only a time of political struggle but also of personal endurance and patience. He constantly educated himself, developed new strategies, and prepared for the Great Revolution of 1917. Without these difficult years spent in Europe, history might have unfolded very differently. The year 1917 was a turning point not only for Russia but also for world history. The The centuries-old Tsarist regime was shaken by the devastation caused by wars and internal crises. World War I had led to the deaths of millions, the collapse of the economy, and deep divisions within society. The popular uprising that began in February forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. The newly established provisional government failed to meet the demands of the people and chose to continue the war. This created great disappointment among the masses. With the help of Germany, Lenin decided to end his exile and return to Russia. His historic journey on the so-called sealed train marked a major turning point for him. During this journey, he closely observed the chaos engulfing Russia and the desperate cries of the people. He published the April Theses, in which he called for an immediate end to the war, the redistribution of land to the peasants, and the transfer of all political power to the Soviets, that is, the councils of workers and soldiers. Lenin's slogan, "All power to the Soviets," quickly spread among the people. During the summer, the Soviets grew stronger and public support increased. In October, the Bolsheviks launched a successful coup on the Winter Palace, overthrowing the provisional government. This marked the beginning of a new era in history. Lenin was now the de facto leader of Russia. Alongside the revolutionary enthusiasm and hope, daunting tasks awaited him. The country was exhausted by war, the economy had collapsed, and civil war loomed on the horizon. Yet Lenin and the Bolsheviks were determined to build a new society despite these harsh conditions. In this chapter, we will examine the 1917 revolution and how Lenin shaped this historic moment in detail. As the sounds of artillery echoed through Petrograd, the Bolsheviks had seized power. But this was only the beginning. For Lenin, the real task was just beginning, to build a socialist society on the ruins of a collapsed empire. The first days of the revolution were chaotic yet filled with hope. At Lenin's command, the Decree on Land was issued. This decree distributed land to the peasants who had been landless for centuries, putting an end to the dominance of the landowning aristocracy. For the first time, millions of peasants became landowners. This decision reinforced Lenin's influence over the peasantry. With the Decree on Peace, a call for unconditional peace was made to all parties involved in the war. However, this was an idealistic call and clashed with the harsh realities. The war with Germany had to end. For this reason, Lenin made a highly controversial decision, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This treaty was a harsh peace agreement in which Russia accepted massive territorial losses. Even within the Bolshevik party, many opposed the agreement. Trotsky suggested dragging out negotiations. But Lenin was resolute. Peace must be made if it means preserving power, because we can only build socialism if we remain in power, he argued. During this time, paths diverged from the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and other leftist groups. Lenin's Bolsheviks became increasingly centralized. Tolerance for dissenting views diminished. This laid the groundwork for the authoritarian Soviet regime that would emerge later. By 1918, Lenin found himself in an even more difficult situation. Supporters of the old regime, bourgeois forces, foreign-backed armies, monarchists, and even some former allies had united against the Bolsheviks. The civil war was beginning. In the same year, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed by firing squad in Yekaterinburg, with Lenin's knowledge. This marked not only the end of the Romanov dynasty but also the end of Russia's centuries-long monarchical tradition. The new government began to directly intervene in everyday life. Factories were nationalized, and worker control was implemented. The currency rapidly lost its value. Hunger spread through the cities. Lenin would later refer to this period as war communism. Lenin argued that a transitional phase was necessary to realize revolutionary ideals. This logic justified many restrictions, coercive measures, and, when necessary, violence. He wasn't just fighting his enemies, he was also trying to shape the minds of the people. Freedom of the press was abolished. All newspapers except those aligned with the Bolshevik line were shut down. A secret police force called the Cheka was established. According to Lenin, it was the guardian of the revolution, but in practice, it led to the arrest, torture, and execution of hundreds of thousands of people. During this period, Lenin's thinking underwent a significant shift. The revolution could no longer be protected by ideas alone. It needed power, violence, and control. Yet despite all these harsh measures, Lenin remained a symbol of hope for the masses. Factory workers saw him as one of us. He worked up to 18 hours a day, tried to stay in contact with the people, gave speeches, wrote articles, and shaped the Soviet administration. From 1922 onward, Lenin's health steadily deteriorated. After suffering his first stroke, questions about who would succeed him began to surface in the shadows of the party. From that point on, Lenin entered a period of both physical and mental decline. He had difficulty speaking and communicated with those around him mainly through written notes. Yet even in this silence, he continued to observe internal party developments with his sharp political insight and foresight. During this time, Lenin wrote his famous Testament, aiming to shape the political legacy he would leave behind. This document was a candid assessment of the leading figures in the Bolshevik Party and expressed his concerns about the future. The most striking lines were directed at Joseph Stalin. Lenin warned about the dangers of Stalin's increasing concentration of power, openly expressing his discomfort with Stalin's rude behavior and dictatorial tendencies. He even suggested that the party consider removing Stalin from his position as General Secretary. However, the testament was kept secret among party members because Lenin's proposal had the potential to shake the party to its core. When Lenin died on January 21, 1924, the entire Soviet Union was plunged into mourning. His body was placed on public display in Moscow's Red Square. Thousands lined up for hours to bid farewell to their leader. His body was embalmed temporarily, but that temporary status eventually turned into a permanent monument. The Lenin Mausoleum became one of the sacred temples of Soviet ideology. But with Lenin's death, it was not just his ideas that ended, it was his authority. The question of who would take his place was not merely a leadership issue, but a struggle to determine the direction of the revolution. It was at this point that the historic conflict between Trotsky and Stalin emerged. Trotsky, who had founded the Red Army during the revolution, was a figure known for his intellectual depth and powerful oratory. In Lenin's eyes, Trotsky held a special place. However, he was uneasy with the party's growing bureaucracy and consistently advocated for permanent revolution, believing the Soviet revolution could not survive unless it was supported by a global uprising. Stalin, on the other hand, followed a different path. He was quieter, more strategic, and gradually accumulated power within the party structure. His idea of socialism in one country aimed to strengthen the Soviet Union in isolation, shielding it from foreign interventions. Stalin's primary strategy was to take control of the party machinery, build a network of loyal cadres, and systematically eliminate opposition. During this process, Stalin skillfully buried Lenin's testament, marginalized Trotsky, and politically isolated him. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the party, and in 1929, he was exiled. With these developments, Stalin became the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union. However, this leadership change was not just a matter of names. The idealistic spirit of revolution that Lenin had left behind was gradually replaced by Stalin's authoritarian regime, characterized by a planned economy, forced collectivization, and political repression. While Stalin continued to reference Lenin's ideas in his rhetoric, in practice, his policies veered dramatically away from Lenin's intentions. Lenin had always advocated for collective decision-making within the party, not dictatorship. Stalin twisted this legacy to serve his own ends. The vacuum created by Lenin's death opened the door to one of the darkest and most controversial periods in Soviet history, the era of Stalinism. Yet despite everything, Lenin's image continued to be glorified in Soviet propaganda as the great leader and the father of the revolution. His name lived on in cities, public squares, factories, and children's school books. Lenin was no longer alive, but his name and symbol became the ideological cornerstone of the Soviet state. The life of Vladimir Lenin is not just the story of an individual, but of a struggle that changed the fate of an entire era and ideology. Reflecting on, discussing, and learning from this great leader who altered the course of history is crucial for understanding the present day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments. See you in the next videos.